Hi there, tonight we're stepping back in time, not to a grand ball or a bustling market, but into the surprisingly private and often challenging world of Victorian women, and how they dealt with something utterly universal, yet rarely spoken of, their periods. Imagine, if you will, the rustle of heavy skirts, the faint scent of lavender and starch, the dim glow of gaslight, and then, beneath it all, the silent, intimate reality of a woman navigating her monthly cycle in an era utterly devoid of the convenient, discreet products we take for granted today. You probably won't survive a single week in their shoes without feeling a profound appreciation for modern hygiene. Let me tell you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments too. It's always fun to see where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported to a bustling London street in the late 19th century, the air thick with horse-drawn carriage fumes and the distant cries of street vendors. But our focus isn't on the public spectacle. It's on the quiet, internal world of the women moving through it. In this era, menstruation wasn't just a physical process. It was a deeply ingrained social construct shrouded in a veil of polite silence and, frankly, outright fear. Mainstream historical fact: Victorian society upheld strict codes of modesty and decorum, especially concerning the female body. Anything related to bodily functions, particularly those as messy and unpredictable as menstruation, was relegated to the private sphere, never to be openly discussed, let alone acknowledged in mixed company. You wouldn't find pamphlets on menstrual health in your local bookshop, nor would advertisements for feminine hygiene products grace the pages of your newspaper. Well, not yet, anyway. This pervasive silence meant that information, when it was exchanged at all, passed in hushed tones between mothers and daughters, sisters, or close female friends. Imagine trying to figure out how to manage something so fundamental without Google, without readily available products, and without anyone really explaining what was happening to your body beyond vague pronouncements about the curse or being unwell. It's like being handed a complex jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing and no picture on the box. Historians still argue whether this profound lack of open discourse was purely a reflection of prudishness or also a deliberate mechanism to control and mystify female physiology. Perhaps a bit of both, don't you think? The very idea of a woman's body having its own natural rhythms, independent of malcontrol, was unsettling to the patriarchal structures of the time. This cultural suppression wasn't just about politeness. It actively shaped the practical realities of menstrual management. You're not just dealing with the physical discomfort, you're battling a social anxiety, a constant fear of exposure, of revealing something deemed impure or unseemly. A quirky tidbit, perhaps, but one that highlights the era's sensibilities. Some medical texts even suggested that fresh air and vigorous exercise during one's monthly indisposition could be harmful, leading to further complications. It's almost as if they were saying, just lie down, dear, and try not to think about your inconvenient biology too much. So, as you walk these Victorian streets, you carry not just your reticule and parasol, but also the weight of an unspoken secret, a monthly challenge that demands ingenuity, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to discretion. The foundations of how these women dealt with their periods were laid not in factories producing disposable goods, but in the domestic sphere, often with needle and thread, and a profound understanding of the limitations imposed by their world. You're about to discover the sheer resourcefulness that blossomed in the shadows of Victorian propriety. As you delve deeper into the private lives of Victorian women, you quickly realize that the silence surrounding menstruation wasn't merely a social quirk. It was a deeply ingrained taboo that shaped every aspect of how a woman experienced her period. Imagine a world where a natural bodily function was considered so unmentionable, so inherently unclean or unladylike, that its very existence was swept under the plush rugs of polite society. This wasn't just about being discreet. It was about outright denial. The widespread belief was that a lady, a truly refined woman, simply didn't acknowledge such base biological realities. You were expected to present a facade of serene, unchanging grace, regardless of what your body was doing. This pervasive silence had profound consequences. For one, it meant that very few euphemisms even existed for menstruation that weren't clinical or vaguely negative. You might hear whispers of being unwell, the monthly visitor, or indisposed. It's a bit like trying to describe a vibrant rainbow using only shades of grey. The vocabulary simply wasn't there to capture the experience without judgment. This linguistic void perpetuated the idea that it was something shameful, something to be hidden at all costs. Historians still argue whether this profound lack of open discourse contributed to, or was merely a symptom of, the era's broader anxieties about female sexuality and autonomy. Did the silence make it worse, or was it just a reflection of an already oppressive reality? The fear of detection was constant. You had to worry about stains on your clothing, about feeling faint or irritable in public, about any outward sign that might betray your condition. This pressure wasn't just internal. It was reinforced by social expectations. A woman who seemed overly tired or ill during her period might be subtly, or not so subtly, judged for failing to maintain her composure. It painted a picture of womanhood as inherently fragile, susceptible to monthly fits of weakness, which conveniently reinforced the idea that women were naturally suited for the domestic sphere, away from the rigors of public life. It's almost as if society collectively decided, if we don't talk about it, maybe it won't be quite so messy, a quirky tidbit that underscores this secrecy. Many Victorian-era health guides, when they did deign to mention female anatomy, would use incredibly vague and often flowery language, referring to the uterus as the sacred organ or the seat of creation, while completely glossing over its more mundane, monthly functions. It's like admiring the beautiful stained glass windows of a cathedral while studiously ignoring the plumbing. This deliberate obfuscation meant that accurate information was incredibly hard to come by, leaving many young women to navigate their first experiences with fear and confusion, relying on trial and error or the scant knowledge passed down from older female relatives. You were expected to just know how to manage it, without ever being explicitly told. This deeply embedded social stigma meant that women developed incredibly ingenious, if often uncomfortable, methods for managing their periods, all centered around discretion and reusability. There were no brightly packaged, disposable products waiting on a supermarket shelf. Instead, you relied on materials that were readily available in the home, often repurposed from other uses. This resourcefulness, born out of necessity and societal pressure, is what we'll explore next. You'll find that the solutions were practical, if not always pleasant, and certainly far removed from the comfort and convenience of today. The weight of this taboo, however, lingered for generations, a silent shadow over women's health. Given the pervasive silence and the utter lack of commercially available sanitary products, What did Victorian women actually use? Your imagination might conjure images of elaborate contraptions, but the reality was far more mundane and, crucially, fabric-based. This was the era of cloth, of resourceful repurposing, of making do with what was at hand. Mainstream historical fact: the vast majority of Victorian women relied on various forms of absorbent fabric to manage their menstrual flow. Forget cotton balls and adhesive strips. Think flannel, linen, and whatever soft, absorbent scraps could be found or afforded. Imagine, for a moment, rummaging through your linen closet, not for fresh towels, but for pieces of worn-out sheets, old shirts, or even bits of blankets that could be cut, folded, and fashioned into something functional. This wasn't a choice driven by environmental consciousness. It was a necessity. The concept of disposable was largely foreign in a society where resources were carefully managed and waste was minimized out of economic pragmatism, not ecological awareness. You reused everything until it literally fell apart. This applied just as much, if not more, to something as personal and regularly needed as menstrual protection. The types of fabric varied, of course, depending on what was available and affordable. Wealthier households might have access to softer, finer linens or flannels, perhaps even specially woven materials. Poorer women, on the other hand, would use coarser rags, bits of old clothing, or whatever scraps they could salvage. Historians still argue whether the comfort level between social classes varied significantly, or if discomfort was simply a universal experience, regardless of the fabric's softness. It's a good question. A scratchy piece of linen is still a scratchy piece of linen, after all, no matter your bank balance. This reliance on fabric meant that the process was inherently more hands-on and intimate than modern methods. You weren't simply unwrapping a product, you were engaging directly with the materials, preparing them, and then, crucially, cleaning them afterward. This constant interaction with the physical reality of menstruation, while perhaps fostering a different kind of bodily awareness, also added significant labor to a woman's already demanding domestic routine. It's a bit like deciding to churn your own butter every week when there's a dairy down the street. Entirely feasible, but certainly more effort. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates this resourcefulness: some women would even use pieces of old curtains or worn-out blankets if nothing else was available, prioritizing absorbency and thickness over aesthetic appeal or specific fabric type. Imagine the sheer practicality, bordering on desperation, that would lead to such improvisation. You weren't looking for elegance, you were looking for something that would simply work. The goal was containment and discretion, preventing any outward signs of flow. The ubiquitous cloth was, therefore, not just a material, it was a solution, a challenge, and a constant reminder of the intimate relationship Victorian women had with their bodies and the limited options available to them. It set the stage for the specific inventions and adaptations that would become the primary means of managing menstruation. Chief among them, the cleverly named tea bandage. You can almost feel the rough texture of the cloth as we prepare to unravel its secrets. Now that you've grasped the fundamental reliance on fabric, let's hone in on the most prevalent and perhaps ingenious solution of the era: the tea bandage or tea bandage. This wasn't some exotic, herbal concoction. The name likely derived from its shape or perhaps its discreet, unassuming nature, like a simple tea towel. Mainstream historical fact: the tea bandage was essentially a long strip of absorbent cloth, often flannel or a similar soft material, designed to be held in place by a belt worn around the hips. Imagine a strip of fabric, perhaps 20 to 30 inches long and several inches wide, folded and padded in the middle. This central, thicker part was designed to sit between your legs, catching the menstrual flow. The ends of the strip would then pass front and back, looping up to attach to a specially designed belt, often made of sturdy cotton or elasticized material, that you wore around your waist or hips. It's a bit like a crude, reusable sanitary napkin, but without any adhesive to keep it truly secure. You were relying purely on the tension of the belt and the friction of your undergarments. The design was deceptively simple, yet effective for its time. The key was the belt, which kept the pad from shifting too much, although perfect immobility was probably a dream. You'd thread the ends of the fabric, strip through loops or buttons on the belt, adjusting it to your comfort or, more accurately, to the point where it felt reasonably secure. This setup meant that while the pad itself was absorbent, its effectiveness was heavily reliant on how well it stayed in place throughout the day. A quirky tidbit: some belts even had small pockets or clasps where women could tuck in additional absorbent material for heavier flow, making a sort of multi-layered system. Resourceful, right? The beauty of the T-bandage was its reusability. Once soiled, it wasn't simply thrown away. Oh no, that would be wasteful and entirely against the Victorian ethos. Instead, it would be carefully removed, prepared for washing, and then laundered, ready for its next use. This cycle of use, wash, and reuse was a constant, almost ritualistic, part of a Victorian woman's monthly routine. Historians still argue whether the term T-bandage was a universal term across all regions and social classes, or if it was more localized slang. It's fascinating how specific terminology for such a personal item can vary. Think about the sheer practicality of this system. It didn't require complex manufacturing. It could be sewn at home from readily available materials. This made it accessible to women across various social strata, from the lady of the manor with her fine linens to the working-class woman with her repurposed rags. The ingenuity lay in its adaptability and its embrace of the materials at hand. You weren't waiting for an invention to solve your problem. You were inventing the solution yourself, or at least adapting a common practice. As you consider the simple T-bandage, you start to grasp the daily realities, the slight bulk beneath, your voluminous skirts, the constant awareness of its presence, the quiet vigilance against leaks. It wasn't seamless, it wasn't invisible, but for millions of Victorian women, it was the best, and often only, option available for navigating their monthly flow with a semblance of discretion. This humble piece of cloth and its accompanying belt were, in many ways, the unsung heroes of Victorian female life. So, you've got this fundamental piece of menstrual tech, the T-bandage, but where did it come from? Was it a mass-produced item you could pick up at the chemist, or a humble creation born from necessity? The answer, as with many aspects of Victorian life, depends heavily on your social standing. Mainstream historical fact: these cloth pads could be both purchased or meticulously homemade, reflecting the economic realities and domestic skills of the time. For women of means, you might find specific shops, often draperies or apothecaries, that discreetly sold sanitary towels or ladies' necessities. These wouldn't be displayed prominently in the shop window, of course. Imagine having to quietly ask the shopkeeper, perhaps a stern-faced woman behind the counter, for those certain items. These commercially produced pads, while still cloth-based and reusable, might have been made from finer, softer materials like bird's-eye cotton or high-quality flannel, perhaps even pre-shaped and hemmed for convenience. They represented a small luxury, saving a woman the time and effort of preparation. You paid for convenience and a touch more refinement, much like you might choose between a designer handbag and one you stitched yourself from an old tapestry. However, for the vast majority of Victorian women, particularly those in working homes or rural areas, the idea of purchasing such items was either an unthinkable expense or simply not an option due to lack of availability. For them, homemade pads were the undeniable reality. Think of the hours spent, perhaps by lamplight after a long day, meticulously cutting strips from old worn-out garments, flannel petticoats, cotton sheets, even softened linen tablecloths that had seen better days. You weren't just making a menstrual pad. You were extending the life of existing fabrics, practicing an economy that was deeply ingrained in Victorian household management. Historians still argue whether the quality and absorbency of homemade pads varied so widely that it significantly impacted a woman's comfort and daily life. You can imagine the difference between a carefully crafted flannel pad and a rough piece of repurposed sackcloth. This act of making was often a skill passed down from mother to daughter, a quiet, practical education in self-sufficiency. It was part of the unspoken curriculum of womanhood. You learned how to cut the fabric to size, how to fold it for maximum absorbency and comfort, and perhaps even how to stitch a few edges to prevent fraying. A quirky tidbit: some women would even collect soft old knitwear, unravel it, and then rin it or crochet small, thick, absorbent squares, demonstrating an incredible level of dedication to finding the perfect, most comfortable solution. It's a testament to their ingenuity, isn't it? Whether purchased or homemade, the core principle remained the same. These were reusable items. The concept of a single-use, disposable product simply didn't exist for most people in this context. This meant that the creation or acquisition of the pads was just the first step. The ongoing management of them, the washing, the drying, the discreet storage formed the bulk of the monthly routine. You didn't just deal with your period. You managed its physical aftermath in an ongoing cycle. This decision, or rather, this necessity to reuse, shaped the daily hygiene practices of millions of women, leading us directly to the next crucial step in their monthly routine, the washing ritual. So you've chosen your weapon against the flow. Whether a finely stitched purchase pad or a lovingly or resignedly crafted homemade one, now comes the part that truly sets Victorian menstrual hygiene apart from our own era of flush and forget. The washing ritual, mainstream historical fact. Reusable cloth pads necessitated a rigorous, often laborious, and always discreet washing process. This wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about managing a secret. Imagine, if you will, the domestic scene. The laundry in a Victorian home was already an immense task. A multi-day ordeal involving boiling water, harsh soaps, scrubbing boards, and heavy irons. Now, into this already formidable routine, you had to integrate the washing of your personal, soiled menstrual cloths. This wasn't something you'd toss into the communal laundry basket for the laundress, unless you were incredibly wealthy and had a very understanding and well-paid laundress. This was your responsibility, handled with the utmost privacy. You certainly wouldn't want a male member of the household, or even an unrelated female servant, stumbling upon such an intimate, telltale item. The process often began with an initial rinse. You'd take the soiled pads to a private wash basin, or perhaps a chamber pot designated for this purpose, and rinse out the bulk of the blood in cold water. Cold water was crucial to prevent the blood from setting into the fabric, making stains permanent. This initial rinse was a hands-on, visceral experience, far removed from the sterile click of a washing machine. You were literally washing away the evidence of your body's natural processes. Historians still argue whether the perceived uncleanness of menstrual blood contributed to the intense stigma, or if the stigma itself created the perception of uncleanliness. It's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario, isn't it? After the initial rinse, the pads would then be soaked, often in a bucket or tub, perhaps with some strong lye soap or a similar harsh detergent of the day. They might be left to soak overnight, to loosen any remaining stains. Then came the scrubbing. You'd likely use a stiff brush or a washboard, putting real elbow grease into the task, ensuring every trace of blood was removed. This was not just for hygiene, it was for appearances. A perfectly clean, unstained pad was a sign of diligent womanhood, whereas a poorly washed one might betray your secret. A quirky tidbit: some women would add a bit of borax or even a touch of ammonia to the washing water, believing it would not only clean better, but also purify the fabric. The lengths they went to for hygiene, even with limited knowledge of germ theory, are quite remarkable. You weren't just washing a piece of cloth, you were performing a small, clandestine act of domestic alchemy. The ultimate goal was not just cleanliness, but discretion. The washed pads then needed to be dried, and this, perhaps even more than the washing, presented a logistical challenge that required careful planning and a keen understanding of household dynamics. You couldn't just hang them on the clothesline for all the world to see, could you? The drying process was the final, critical step in maintaining the profound secrecy that enveloped menstruation in the Victorian era, leading us to the hidden spaces where these intimate items found their way back to readiness. You've meticulously washed your cloth pads, scrubbing away every trace, but the challenge isn't over. Now comes the delicate dance of hidden drying spaces, a logistical ballet performed in the shadows of Victorian domesticity. Mainstream historical fact: women had to find ingenious and discreet ways to dry their reusable menstrual cloths, far from the prying eyes of servants, family members, and certainly any male gaze. Imagine the typical Victorian home, often bustling, with limited private spaces, and certainly no dedicated drying room for such intimate items. You couldn't just peg them out on the main clothesline in the garden, flapping conspicuously in the breeze for all your neighbours and the vicar to see. That would be an unthinkable breach of decorum, a blatant revelation of something considered utterly private and, as you remember from earlier, rather shameful. The unspoken rule was out of sight, out of mind, and definitely out of public view. So where did they go? You might imagine a resourceful woman hanging her freshly washed pads on a clothes horse tucked away in a seldom used corner of her bedroom, perhaps behind a tall wardrobe or a dressing screen. Or maybe they found a temporary home on a small line strung across the inside of a closed wardrobe, where the air circulation might be poor but the privacy was paramount. Think about the dampness, the slow drying times, and the constant worry of them not being thoroughly dry before they were needed again. It's a bit like trying to dry your delicate laundry in a damp cave, challenging to say the least. For women who lived in smaller, less grand homes, the options were even more limited. Perhaps they'd be draped over the back of a chair near the hearth in the quiet hours of the night, hoping the residual warmth would aid drying without drawing attention, or carefully placed under a pillow, if desperation truly set in and air drying wasn't an option. Historians still argue whether the challenge of discreet drying led to women needing a larger supply of pads, simply to ensure a dry rotation was always available, even if it took days for a single pad to fully dry. The more sets you had, the less pressure there was for immediate drying. A quirky tidbit that highlights the lengths gone to for discretion. Some women would even dry them inside their drawers, underpants, using the garment itself as a cover, or roll them tightly inside a clean towel and leave them on a warm windowsill. It's a testament to the ingenuity born from necessity and extreme social pressure. You were constantly improvising, adapting, and finding new ways to keep your secrets safe. This process of meticulous washing and hidden drying wasn't just a chore, it was a silent ritual, performed monthly, reinforcing the isolation and personal responsibility Victorian women felt regarding their bodies. It speaks volumes about the societal constraints placed upon them, forcing them to navigate their natural bodily functions with a level of secrecy that feels almost unimaginable today. The effort involved makes you truly appreciate the sheer convenience of a disposable pad or tampon, doesn't it? But while cloth was king, some women did turn to other, even more rudimentary methods for internal absorption, a topic we'll explore next. While cloth pads, discreetly washed and dried, were the mainstay. Not every Victorian woman relied solely on external protection. For some, a more internal solution, however rudimentary, was sought. Mainstream historical fact, beyond fabric pads. Some women did employ natural sea sponges as a form of internal menstrual absorption. Imagine venturing into an apothecary or a specific purveyor of hygienic articles and quietly acquiring a natural sea sponge. These wouldn't be the synthetic sponges you see in modern kitchens. They were organic, porous, and wonderfully absorbent, harvested from the ocean floor. You'd select a small, soft, pliable one, perhaps the size of a plum or a small apple, depending on your needs. The appeal was clear. Once inserted, it offered a degree of freedom and discretion that an external pad, no matter how carefully managed, could never truly provide. You could move more freely, perhaps even ride a horse without the constant worry of shifting cloth. The use of sea sponges wasn't without its challenges, however. Firstly, hygiene was a significant concern. While natural, these sponges needed to be thoroughly cleaned after each use to prevent bacterial growth. You would rinse them repeatedly, often in cold water, perhaps even boiling them periodically to sterilize them, a risky endeavor that could degrade the sponge over time. The drying process, again, would have to be equally discreet, as a damp sponge could quickly become a breeding ground for unpleasant odors and infections. Historians still argue whether the perceived benefits of freedom outweighed the potential health risks associated with inadequate cleaning in an era before widespread understanding of germ theory. It's a bit like playing Russian roulette with your internal flora. Insertion and removal also presented their own practical difficulties. Without a string or applicator, like a modern tampon, you relied solely on your fingers. This required a level of comfort with one's own body that might have been at odds with the deeply ingrained Victorian sense of modesty, especially for women, who had been raised to view their bodies, particularly their intimate parts, with a degree of apprehension or even shame. A quirky tidbit that hints at this discomfort. Some sources suggest women would attach a small loop of thread to the sponge to aid in removal, an early, homemade precursor to the modern tampon string. Ingenious, yet still far from ideal. The concept of internal absorption, even in this nascent form, speaks to a desire for greater freedom and less bulk. While not as widespread as cloth pads, The use of sea sponges shows that some Victorian women were actively seeking alternative solutions to the challenges of menstruation, pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable or even possible. For personal hygiene, you can almost feel the gentle dampness and porous texture of the sponge, a small, quiet revolution tucked away from the world. It paved the way, however subtly, for the development of more sophisticated internal products in the distant future. Building upon the idea of internal solutions, some Victorian women took the concept of absorbency and discretion a step further, experimenting with materials that could be easily shaped for internal use. Mainstream historical fact: beyond sea sponges, some women also employed rolled-up cotton or even sheep's wool as rudimentary forms of internal menstrual absorption, bearing a striking, albeit primitive, resemblance to modern tampons. Imagine a woman carefully taking a length of raw, unbleached cotton batting, or perhaps a soft, clean tuft of sheep's wool, and rolling it tightly into a cylindrical shape. The goal was to create a compact, absorbent plug that could be inserted into the vaginal canal. The appeal was similar to that of the sea sponge: reduced bulk, greater freedom of movement, and the ultimate in discretion, as there was no external sign of protection whatsoever. You could wear your most form-fitting, by Victorian standards, gown without a telltale bulge. However, the practicalities were far from ideal. Unlike manufactured tampons today, these homemade versions lacked any form of applicator, meaning direct manual insertion was the only method. This, again, brought you face to face with the societal taboo against touching or even acknowledging one's own intimate anatomy. And unlike the more structured modern tampon, these rolled materials could potentially unravel or shift, leading to discomfort or, worse, leakage. Historians still argue whether the perceived risk of infection from these non-sterile homemade devices was a significant deterrent to their widespread use, especially considering the limited medical understanding of germ theory at the time. You can only imagine the myriad of possible complications. Hygiene, as with the sea sponges, was a paramount concern. These natural fibers, if not kept perfectly clean and dry before insertion, could harbor bacteria, and unlike the easily washable cloth pads, extracting and cleaning a thoroughly saturated roll of cotton or wool for reuse would have been a messy, perhaps impossible task. It's likely that these rudimentary tampons were considered more disposable in the sense that they were discarded after a single use, or, at most, a day's wear, which would have made them a considerably more expensive option for most women, given the cost of raw materials. A quirky tidbit: some accounts suggest women would tie a piece of string or ribbon around the center of their rolled cotton, leaving a tail for easier removal, mirroring the design of modern tampons even in this nascent stage. Ingenuity truly knows no bounds, does it? These early tampon-like devices highlight a fascinating push and pull between the desire for comfort and discretion and the severe limitations of technology and social acceptance. While not nearly as common as external cloth pads, their existence points to a quiet, often unrecorded history of women experimenting with their own bodies and materials to find better ways to manage a fundamental biological process. You can almost feel the soft, slightly coarse texture of the wool or cotton as it's rolled, a testament to personal improvisation in a world that offered few ready-made solutions. It's a powerful reminder that women have always found ways to cope, even when society provided little support. While some Victorian women sought solutions in cloth pads, sponges, or rolled fibers, A stark and often overlooked reality for many was the complete absence of any dedicated menstrual protection. Mainstream historical fact: for a significant number of women, especially in the poorest strata of society or in very remote rural areas, the primary method of managing menstruation was simply to bleed into their clothing. Imagine this grim reality. You are a farm laborer, perhaps, or a washerwoman, toiling from dawn till dusk. You have no spare change for even the cheapest cloth, no time for elaborate washing rituals, and certainly no access to any form of commercial product. Your undergarments, often thick and layered, became your de facto menstrual protection. The sheer practical burden of this is immense. You would experience the constant dampness, the chafing, and the pervasive fear of visible staining. It's like trying to catch a waterfall with a sieve, utterly inadequate, profoundly uncomfortable, and publicly humiliating. This wasn't a choice. It was a desperate necessity driven by poverty and circumstance. For these women, the menstrual period wasn't just an inconvenience or a secret. It was a deeply unpleasant, often smelly, and physically restrictive time. The thick skirts and numerous petticoats worn by Victorian women, while perhaps inadvertently offering a slight buffer against visible leaks, were certainly not designed for absorption. They merely provided a layer of concealment, a last line of defense against public exposure. Historians still argue whether the physical toll of this lack of hygiene contributed significantly to higher rates of infections or other health issues among impoverished women. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? The direct link between poverty and suffering. The pervasive odor associated with unmanaged menstrual flow would have been a constant challenge, both for the individual woman and those around her. While Victorian society generally had a higher tolerance for bodily odors than we do today, the distinct smell of blood would have been difficult to mask. This further amplified the stigma, solidifying the idea of menstruation as something dirty or repulsive. You can almost feel the constant anxiety, the desire to remain invisible, to blend into the background and not draw attention to yourself. A quirky tidbit that underscores this hardship: in some extremely rural or isolated communities, women might resort to using natural materials like moss or leaves if nothing else was available, though these would offer minimal protection and carry their own risks of irritation and infection. It paints a picture of incredible resilience and profound deprivation. You were making do with literally whatever the land provided. This stark reality of bleeding into clothing stands as a powerful counterpoint to the more refined, if still challenging, methods employed by other Victorian women. It reminds you that while ingenuity was often born of necessity, sometimes necessity simply meant enduring profound discomfort and indignity. This silent suffering, largely unrecorded in the polite histories of the era, speaks volumes about the unevenness of life and the immense burden placed on the most vulnerable women. It also begins to hint at how the very clothing they wore became an unwitting part of their menstrual management strategy, a topic we will explore next. Having explored the often harsh realities of menstrual management, you might wonder how Victorian women, even those without specialized pads, managed to maintain any semblance of discretion. The answer lies surprisingly in fashion's silent role. Mainstream historical fact: the voluminous and layered nature of Victorian fashion, while not intentionally designed for menstrual management, inadvertently provided a significant advantage in concealing leaks and bulk. Imagine the typical silhouette of a mid to late Victorian woman: crinolines, bustles, numerous petticoats, and heavy outer skirts. These layers, often made from thick, opaque fabrics like wool, tweed, or heavy cotton, created a substantial physical barrier between a woman's body and the outside world. You weren't wearing flimsy, form-fitting garments that would immediately betray any sign of dampness or bulk. Instead, you were encased in a fortress of fabric, a veritable camouflage against the telltale signs of menstruation. It's like wearing a personal, portable privacy screen, isn't it? The sheer volume of these garments meant that even if a leak occurred, it had multiple layers to contend with before potentially reaching the outermost skirt. A small stain on an innermost petticoat might never be seen by anyone. This multi-layered defense allowed women a crucial margin of error, reducing the constant anxiety of a public mishap. You could, perhaps, feel a dampness, but the risk of it being visible to others was significantly mitigated by the architectural complexity of your attire. Historians still argue whether the evolving fashion trends of the era, particularly the increasing emphasis on bustles and elaborate rear draping, were in any subconscious way influenced by the need for greater concealment around the lower body. It's an interesting thought that fashion might unwittingly serve a deeper, unspoken purpose. Consider the practical advantages. The natural folds and gathers of a large skirt, often extending to the floor, could easily hide any bulk from a cloth pad or even the unfortunate reality of bleeding directly into undergarments. The fabric itself, heavy and often dark in color, would be less likely to show minor stains than lighter, thinner materials. A quirky tidbit that illustrates this. Some women would intentionally choose darker colored undergarments or skirts during their period, a subtle yet effective strategy to minimize the visibility of potential accidents. It's a quiet rebellion against the biological facts of life. So, while designers were focused on aesthetics and social status, you, the Victorian woman, benefited from a happy accident of sartorial engineering. Your clothes weren't just about looking fashionable. They were a crucial part of your monthly survival kit, offering a degree of protection and peace of mind that modern, minimalist fashion simply can't. This unintended synergy between fashion and function highlights the ingenious ways women adapted to their circumstances, using every available resource to maintain their privacy and decorum. The garments beneath those voluminous skirts, however, played an even more direct and specific role, leading us to examine the inner layers of Victorian dress. You've seen how the voluminous outer layers of Victorian fashion offered an unexpected shield. But what about closer to the body? The undergarments and layers worn beneath those grand skirts played an equally, if not more, direct role in a woman's menstrual management strategy. Mainstream historical fact. Victorian women wore multiple layers of underclothing, including chemises, corsets, camisoles, and most importantly for our discussion, drawers and petticoats, which provided both hygiene and a degree of absorption. Imagine starting your day by putting on a chemise, a loose-fitting shift worn next to the skin. Over that, perhaps a corset for shaping, then a camisole or bodice, but crucial for managing your period or your drawers. These weren't the fitted knickers we know today. Victorian drawers often came in two separate legs that tied at the waist, or were simply split at the crotch. This open crotch design, while seemingly counterintuitive for menstrual hygiene, was actually quite common, allowing for easier use of chamber pots and outdoor privies without fully disrobing. For menstrual management, a cloth pad, your tea bandage, perhaps, would be positioned between these split legs and held in place by your belt and the compression of your outer garments. It's a bit like a cleverly designed, though somewhat precarious, holding system. Then came the petticoats, usually several of them. These were not just for adding volume to your skirts. They served practical purposes. Made of cotton, flannel, or even wool, they provided warmth, prevented outer skirts from clinging, and, crucially, offered additional layers of absorbency and protection. If a leak occurred, the petticoats would be the first line of defense after the pad itself. The thicker and more numerous the petticoats, the greater the chance that any minor seep would be contained, sparing your expensive outer dress. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of the open crotch drawer design made menstrual management more difficult, requiring greater reliance on external pads and layered petticoats, or if it was merely a practical design suited for other daily needs. It's a debate between practicality and potential mess, isn't it? A quirky tidbit: some women would specifically choose thicker, dark-colored flannel petticoats for their time of the month, knowing that these would offer better absorbency and concealment. These weren't just fashion accessories. They were vital components of a self-managed hygiene system. You weren't just dressing. You were strategically layering for your monthly battle. The constant awareness of these layers, the slight shifting of cloth pads, the vigilance against any telltale dampness or odor. This was your daily reality. Your undergarments weren't just intimate apparel. They were your personal, unacknowledged sanitary system. The practicality of these layers meant that even if you were among those who simply bled into their clothing, the multiple layers of cotton and flannel would offer at least some absorption, preventing an immediate, visible disaster on your outer dress. This intimate knowledge of your own body and the materials that could offer succor was passed down, often wordlessly, from one generation of women to the next, a testament to resilience in the face of societal silence and limited options. Having explored the practicalities of cloth and layers, let's now consider how Victorian women's lives, vastly different from our own, impacted the very rhythm of their menstrual cycles. Mainstream historical fact: Victorian women's periods were often less frequent than modern women's, primarily due to later menopause, earlier menopause, and the profound impact of frequent pregnancies and prolonged breastfeeding. Imagine your life, dictated not just by social custom, but by biological realities that differ significantly from those of today. For starters, menarche, the first menstruation, typically occurred later in the Victorian era than it does now. While today it's common for girls to start their periods around age 12 or 13. Historical evidence suggests that in the 19th century, the average age was often closer to 15 or 16, or even later for girls in poorer conditions with less robust nutrition. You simply had fewer years of menstruating overall. This difference is largely attributed to factors like nutrition, overall health, and the intensity of physical labor from a young age. A body that's constantly working hard and not receiving optimal nourishment will prioritize survival over reproductive readiness. Conversely, menopause often arrived earlier. While today the average age for menopause is around 51 for Victorian women, it could often begin in their late 30s or early 40s. This meant a shorter reproductive lifespan on both ends. You had fewer fertile years, and consequently, fewer menstrual cycles to contend with across your entire life. This isn't to say their lives were easier. It simply meant the duration of active menstruation was condensed. Historians still argue whether the earlier onset of menopause was solely due to nutritional and health factors, or if the sheer physical strain of multiple pregnancies also played a significant role in exhausting the reproductive system prematurely. It's a complex interplay of biology and lifestyle, isn't it? Then there's the monumental impact of reproduction itself. Victorian families were large. It was common for a woman to have many children, sometimes 10 or more, if they survived. You would spend a significant portion of your adult life either pregnant or breastfeeding. A quirky tidbit that highlights this reality. Medical journals of the time often referred to pregnancy and lactation as physiological amenorrhea, a natural cessation of periods. For many women, this meant that once they started their reproductive lives, they might experience very few, if any, uninterrupted menstrual cycles for years, even decades. You were either expecting or nourishing a newborn, leaving little room for your monthly visitor. This extended period of amenorrhea absence of menstruation meant less frequent encounters with the discomforts and challenges of menstruation itself. While the physical toll of frequent pregnancies and childbirth was immense, the upside, from a practical standpoint, was fewer occasions to deal with the messy realities of a period. It's a trade-off that modern women might find astonishing. A life marked by constant pregnancy and childcare, but fewer days of menstruation. This biological rhythm, so different from our own, shaped the everyday experiences of Victorian women profoundly, and it leads us directly to the specifics of how pregnancy impacted their cycles, a constant presence in their adult lives. You've glimpsed how Victorian women's overall reproductive timelines differed, leading to fewer menstrual cycles throughout their lives. Now, let's zero in on one of the most significant factors contributing to that reduced frequency: pregnancies. Impact, mainstream historical fact. For a Victorian woman, pregnancy was not an occasional event, but often a continuous state for a significant portion of her adult life. And with each pregnancy came a natural cessation of menstruation. Imagine your body as a dedicated factory geared towards reproduction. In the Victorian era, from the moment you married, often in your late teens or early 20s, the expectation and biological reality was that you would become pregnant, usually quite quickly. Contraception, as we understand it, was largely non-existent, ineffective, or socially taboo. So, you might find yourself pregnant within months of marriage, then again a year or two later, and so on. This meant that, for many women, once they began their reproductive journey, their menstrual cycle became a rare visitor, interrupted by 9 months of gestation, followed by a period of breastfeeding, which we'll discuss next. The typical pattern for a married Victorian woman, especially in larger families, was a continuous cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and a brief postpartum period, often flowing directly into another pregnancy. You might have a lying-in period after childbirth, a time of rest and recovery, but soon enough, your body would be preparing for the next conception. This meant that the hormonal signals that trigger menstruation were often suppressed for extended periods. You didn't just experience pregnancy, you lived in a state of almost perpetual pregnancy or recovery from it. Historians still argue whether the physical toll of these constant pregnancies, without adequate spacing or modern medical care, contributed to the earlier onset of menopause or other long-term health complications for Victorian women. The cumulative strain on the body must have been immense. A quirky tidbit that emphasizes this point: some women might go for years, even a decade or more, experiencing only a handful of menstrual cycles between their first child and the onset of menopause, due to back-to-back pregnancies and subsequent lactation. It's almost mind-boggling to consider the difference in how often a woman would actively manage her period then versus now. You might spend more time sewing baby clothes than washing cloth pads. This frequent state of pregnancy, while physically demanding and often fraught with danger, given the high rates of infant and maternal mortality, inadvertently provided a break from the monthly inconvenience of menstruation. For a woman dealing with the discomforts of pregnancy, morning sickness, fatigue, the physical changes, at least, she wasn't also grappling with menstrual flow. It's a bittersweet silver lining, a reminder of the relentless biological demands placed upon women in an era that offered few choices or protections. This continuous reproductive cycle leads us naturally to the next significant factor influencing menstrual frequency: the long and often uninterrupted practice of breastfeeding. You've seen how pregnancy dramatically reduced the frequency of menstruation for Victorian women. But even after childbirth, the monthly cycle often remained absent for extended periods, thanks to another widespread practice. Mainstream historical fact: prolonged breastfeeding was a common and crucial method of infant feeding in the Victorian era, and it naturally suppressed ovulation and, consequently, menstruation for many women. Imagine yourself as a new mother. In 1880, there's no formula readily available, and certainly no sterile bottles or refrigeration. Breastfeeding wasn't just a choice. For many, it was the only viable, safe, and affordable way to nourish an infant. You would typically breastfeed on demand, often for a year or even two, sometimes longer, until the child was old enough to be weaned onto solid foods. This wasn't a casual, infrequent nursing schedule. It was often continuous throughout the day and night, especially in the early months. The physiological effect of this frequent, sustained nursing is well documented. It releases hormones that inhibit ovulation. No ovulation, no menstrual period. This natural birth control, known as lactational amenorrhea, meant that for many Victorian mothers, once they gave birth, their periods wouldn't return until they significantly reduced or ceased breastfeeding. You were essentially in a state of suspended fertility, giving your body a brief respite from the relentless cycle of pregnancy and menstruation. Historians still argue whether women had a conscious, albeit unscientific, understanding of breastfeeding's contraceptive effect, or if it was simply a happy, accidental benefit of a necessary practice. Did they connect the dots, or was it just another mysterious aspect of their bodies? This prolonged period of amenorrhea could last for many months, sometimes even a year or more, between pregnancies. If a woman had children close together, she might cycle from pregnancy to breastfeeding to pregnancy again, experiencing only a handful of periods throughout her entire reproductive life. A quirky tidbit that underscores this: some historical accounts mention women being advised by older relatives or midwives to continue breastfeeding as long as possible to space out their children, suggesting a rudimentary awareness of its family planning effect. Even if the biological mechanism wasn't fully understood, it's a fascinating glimpse into folk wisdom. So, for the Victorian mother, the demands of nurturing her children directly impacted her menstrual experience. The very act of sustaining life meant a temporary reprieve from the monthly flow and the challenges of managing it. While the physical demands of constant breastfeeding were considerable, requiring good nutrition and rest often in short supply, it did mean less time spent dealing with cloth pads and the associated anxieties. This extended break from menstruation, courtesy of motherhood, contributed significantly to the overall lower frequency of periods for women in the Victorian era, a stark contrast to the modern experience. Beyond the practicalities of management and the biological rhythms of their bodies, Victorian women also had to contend with the physical discomfort and pain often accompanying their periods. Given the medical knowledge of the era, how did they approach pain management? Remedies. Mainstream historical fact: Victorian women often relied on a combination of domestic remedies, traditional advice, and sometimes the rather limited and occasionally dangerous interventions of medical practitioners. Imagine experiencing severe cramps, back pain, or general malaise, with no readily available ibuprofen or heating pads. Your first line of defense would likely be home remedies passed down through generations. Ginger tea was a popular choice, believed to have warming and soothing properties that could alleviate nausea and cramps. You might brew a strong cup, perhaps with a touch of honey, hoping its warmth would bring some relief. Hot water bottles, often made of rubber or metal and filled with steaming water, were also commonly used. You'd clutch it to your abdomen or lower back, seeking comfort from the radiating heat. It's a bit like a primitive, but often effective, form of localized pain relief. For more persistent pain or general nervousness attributed to the female constitution, stronger remedies might be sought. Patent medicines, widely advertised and unregulated, often contained ingredients like opium, laudanum opium dissolved in alcohol, or even cannabis extracts. These concoctions, promising miraculous relief for female complaints, would certainly dull the pain, but at the significant risk of addiction and dangerous side effects. You were essentially self-medicating with powerful narcotics, often without realizing the true nature of what you were consuming. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of these opiate-laced remedies contributed to a hidden epidemic of female addiction in the Victorian era, masked by euphemisms and societal silence. It's a dark underbelly to the era's medical landscape. Beyond specific remedies, you would also be encouraged to rest. The prevailing medical and social advice was that women were particularly delicate during their monthly indisposition and should avoid strenuous activity. This often translated into a prescribed period of quietude, sometimes even confinement to bed, which, while perhaps offering some physical relief, also reinforced the idea of female fragility. A quirky tidbit: some women would wear menstrual corsets or support belts, which were advertised as providing abdominal compression and support to ease cramps, though their actual efficacy was likely minimal, and they probably added to the discomfort. You were tightening yourself into relief, which sounds rather counterproductive. The limited understanding of female physiology meant that menstrual pain was often attributed to everything from nervous excitement to a sluggish uterus, rather than simply being a normal, albeit sometimes intense, physiological process. This often led to ineffective or even harmful treatments. You were at the mercy of societal beliefs and rudimentary medical knowledge, doing your best to cope with discomfort in an era where effective pain relief was still a distant dream. This emphasis on rest and the perceived frailty of women during their periods also fed into broader medical advice, sometimes leading to the infamous rest cure, which we'll explore next. You've seen how Victorian women battled menstrual pain with home remedies and dubious patent medicines. But for some, especially those with more pronounced discomfort or who exhibited symptoms considered nervous or hysterical, medical advice often escalated to a more drastic and rather infamous prescription: the rest cure. Mainstream historical fact, devised by American neurologist Silas Weir Mitchell. The rest cure was a widely popular, though controversial, medical treatment in the late 19th century, often prescribed for women suffering from a range of nervous disorders, including those exacerbated by or linked to menstruation. Imagine being told by your doctor, a stern-faced gentleman with a neatly trimmed beard, that your monthly discomfort or general nervous debility required you to be confined to bed for weeks sometimes even months. This wasn't a suggestion. It was often a rigid prescription. You would be isolated from your family, forbidden from engaging in any intellectual activity, no reading, no writing, no needlework, and subjected to a strict regimen of forced feeding. Often rich, fatty foods, massage, and often electrotherapy. The goal was to rebuild your nervous system and remove you from the stresses of daily life, particularly those believed to drain women's vital energy, like too much education or independent thought. It's like being sent to a luxurious, but incredibly boring, prison for your own good, for women experiencing severe menstrual pain, or those whose periods seem to trigger broader psychological distress, perhaps due to the immense societal pressure and physical discomfort. The rest cure was sometimes seen as a panacea. The underlying theory was that women had a finite amount of nervous energy, and menstruation, combined with mental exertion, could deplete this energy, leading to various ailments. By forcing complete physical and mental inactivity, the doctors believed they could conserve and restore this precious energy. Historians still argue whether the rest cure, despite its often damaging psychological effects and underlying misogynistic assumptions, offered any genuine, albeit temporary, physical relief simply due to the enforced rest and caloric intake, or if its benefits were purely psychosomatic. You can imagine the sheer boredom leading to a desire to simply feel better. The psychological impact, however, could be devastating. Stripped of autonomy, intellectual stimulation, and social connection, many women found the cure itself more debilitating than the initial ailment. Perhaps the most famous critique came from American writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who suffered under the rest cure and later wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, a chilling short story about a woman driven to madness by her confinement. A quirky tidbit: some male doctors even believed that a woman's uterus was a direct drain on her brain's energy, meaning that to have a healthy mind, the uterus must be kept inactive or controlled. It's almost comically misguided, isn't it? The rest cure, while not exclusively tied to menstruation, certainly highlighted the era's profoundly flawed understanding of female physiology and mental health. It shows you the lengths to which the medical establishment would go to treat women, often with methods that stripped them of their agency and reinforced stereotypes of female weakness. This rather paternalistic approach by doctors leads us, naturally, to a broader look at how the medical profession in general understood and diagnosed women's health in the Victorian period. You've just witnessed the somewhat extreme and often misguided medical response to women's ailments, epitomized by the rest cure. This brings us to a broader, more fundamental question. How did doctors and diagnosis generally approach the female reproductive system and its monthly cycles in the Victorian era? Mainstream historical fact: the medical understanding of female anatomy and physiology was remarkably limited and often intertwined with moralistic and patriarchal assumptions, leading to often inaccurate and sometimes harmful diagnoses. Imagine a Victorian physician, typically a man, trained in a system that viewed the female body as inherently mysterious, delicate, and primarily defined by its reproductive function. Anatomy classes were often focused on male bodies, and what was known about female anatomy was frequently simplified or misinterpreted. The intricate hormonal dance that governs menstruation was completely unknown. Instead, theories often revolved around humors, blood stagnation, or the nervous system. You were seen not just as a patient with symptoms, but as a woman, and your biology was often conflated with your perceived emotional or psychological state. It's like a mechanic trying to fix a complex engine when he's only ever seen a bicycle. When you presented with menstrual pain, irregular cycles, or even just general malaise attributed to your delicate constitution, a doctor might offer a bewildering array of explanations. One prevalent theory was that menstruation was a cleansing process, and any interruption or difficulty indicated a blockage or impurity in the system. This could lead to rather aggressive treatments like purging or bloodletting, practices that were often more harmful than helpful. Historians still argue whether the medical profession's limited understanding was a result of genuine scientific limitations or a reflection of societal discomfort with female bodies, leading to a lack of dedicated research and study, perhaps. A bit of both. A convenient blind spot. Diagnosis often relied heavily on external observation and a patient's vague descriptions, rather than any internal examination, which was considered highly improper and invasive for a respectable woman. A doctor might listen to your pulse, examine your tongue, and inquire about your nervous state, but a direct physical examination of the pelvic region was rare, reserved only for extreme circumstances, and usually performed under a sheet. This modesty, while socially acceptable, severely hampered accurate diagnosis. A quirky tidbit that underscores this: some doctors believed that the uterus itself could wander within the body, causing various ailments from headaches to anxiety, a theory that led to bizarre and ineffective treatments. You were dealing with a doctor who thought your uterus had a mind of its own. The terminology used was often vague and euphemistic, even within medical texts. Conditions related to menstruation or female reproductive health were frequently lumped under broad categories like female complaints, nervous disorders, or, most infamously, hysteria. This lack of precise diagnosis meant that genuine physical ailments might be misattributed to emotional instability or moral failings, leaving women without proper treatment. This pervasive misdiagnosis, particularly the over-reliance on hysteria, directly connects to the next topic: the specific, often ludicrous, theories linking women's health to a wandering womb. You've seen how Victorian doctors often struggled with accurate diagnoses for women, frequently relying on vague terms. Perhaps no term was more pervasive or more indicative of the era's medical misogyny than hysteria and the wandering womb. Mainstream historical fact. For centuries, and certainly throughout the Victorian era, a wide array of female ailments, from anxiety and irritability to fainting spells and even menstrual pain, were conveniently attributed to a condition called hysteria, a diagnosis rooted in the ancient Greek belief of a wandering womb. Imagine being a woman experiencing genuine physical discomfort, emotional distress, or simply boredom with your constrained life, only to be told by a medical professional that your symptoms were caused by your uterus literally moving freely within your body, causing mischief by pressing against other organs or even your brain. This ancient theory that the uterus was a mobile, sentient organ capable of wreaking havoc somehow persisted for thousands of years, reaching its peak in the Victorian period. You weren't suffering from a physical ailment. You were suffering from your own unruly womb. It's like being told your car trouble is due to the engine deciding to go for a stroll. The symptoms attributed to hysteria were incredibly broad and contradictory, encompassing virtually anything that didn't fit neatly into other male-centric diagnoses: melancholy, insomnia, fainting, irritability, excessive laughter or crying, loss of appetite, sexual desire or lack thereof, and, of course, menstrual irregularities or pain. If a woman expressed any form of dissent or failed to conform to societal expectations of quiet domesticity, it could be labeled as hysterical. This conveniently pathologized female emotions and behaviors that challenged the patriarchal norm. Historians still argue whether hysteria was a deliberate tool of social control, designed to keep women submissive, or a genuine, though misguided attempt by doctors to categorize symptoms they couldn't otherwise explain. Given their limited knowledge, it was probably a little of column A and a lot of column B, wasn't it? Treatments for hysteria were as varied and absurd as the diagnosis itself. They ranged from the mild, like rest cures, which you recall, special diets, or nervous tonics often containing alcohol or opiates, to the invasive and frankly horrifying. These included pelvic massage, sometimes performed by doctors or specially trained midwives to bring on a paroxysm or orgasm, believed to relieve uterine congestion, and in extreme cases, even hysterectomies or clitoridectomies performed to cure women of their supposedly unruly natures. A quirky tidbit that adds to the absurdity. Some doctors prescribed horseback riding or sea voyages, believing the jarring motion or fresh air would shake the uterus back into place. You were quite literally being jolted into sanity. The pervasive belief in hysteria meant that a woman's genuine menstrual discomfort or reproductive health issues were often dismissed as mere manifestations of her nervous or unstable female nature, rather than being treated as legitimate physical ailments. You were reduced to your reproductive organs, and those organs were believed to be inherently problematic. This profoundly affected the quality of care women received and further cemented the societal stigma around female bodily functions. The medical establishment's misguided theories not only perpetuated suffering but also reinforced the gender inequalities of the age, deeply impacting how women from different social strata experienced healthcare, which leads us to our next point, about class disparities. You've seen how medical understanding, or rather misunderstanding, deeply colored the Victorian woman's experience. But beyond medical theory, practical realities of life were profoundly shaped by one overriding factor: social class disparities. Mainstream historical fact: a Victorian woman's social standing and economic wealth fundamentally determined her access to resources, comfort, and even dignity when managing her menstrual cycle. Imagine two vastly different scenarios. On one hand, you are a lady of the manor, residing in a spacious home with multiple servants. When your period arrives, you might have a dedicated maid who discreetly handles the washing and drying of your high-quality flannel pads. You have access to softer linens, perhaps even the option of purchasing slightly more refined sanitary towels from an apothecary. When discomfort strikes, you can retreat to your private boudoir, call for a hot water bottle, and perhaps even summon a physician who, while perhaps misguided in his diagnoses, at least offers a degree of personal attention and potentially opium-based pain relief. You have the luxury of privacy, resources, and the means to minimize the physical and social burdens of menstruation. Your struggle is largely one of discretion and managing discomfort in a delicate fashion. On the other hand, you are a factory worker, living in a cramped tenement with little privacy and even less disposable income. When your period arrives, you might have only a few rough rags, repurposed from discarded clothing, to use as pads. There's no private wash basin. You might share a communal pump or privy, and the idea of discreetly washing and drying your soiled cloths is a logistical nightmare. You might be forced to work long hours on your feet, enduring pain and discomfort without the luxury of rest. Pain relief. Perhaps a swig of gin, if you can afford it, or just grim endurance. The fear of visible stains is constant, knowing that a single lapse could mean public humiliation or even the loss of your job. Historians still argue whether the physical and mental stress of managing menstruation in such dire conditions significantly contributed to higher rates of chronic illness and shorter lifespans among working-class women. The burden was not merely inconvenience, it was a matter of survival. This stark contrast highlights how wealth provided not just material comfort, but also the invaluable luxury of privacy and control. A wealthy woman could control her environment, her schedule, and her access to resources. A poor woman had almost no control over any of these. Her body, even in its most private functions, was exposed to the harsh realities of her economic situation. A quirky tidbit that emphasizes this: poorer women, particularly in the bustling, unsanitary urban centers, sometimes resorted to using newspaper or other readily available paper scraps as makeshift absorbents, though these would have been highly ineffective and prone to tearing. You were literally scrounging for solutions. The burden of menstruation, therefore, was not evenly distributed. For the privileged, it was a nuisance to be discreetly managed. For the impoverished, it was a profound physical and social hardship, a constant reminder of their precarious position in society. This class divide also played a significant role in how women experienced their periods based on where they lived, which leads us to explore the differences between rural and urban life. You've just considered how social class profoundly impacted a Victorian woman's menstrual experience. But where she lived, whether in the bustling, grimy heart of a city or the quiet, often isolated embrace of the countryside, also presented unique challenges and resources. Mainstream historical fact: rural versus urban living created distinct variations in how Victorian women managed their periods, influencing access to supplies, medical care, and information. Imagine yourself first in a sprawling Victorian city like London or Manchester. Here, you might have slightly better access to apothecaries and draperies that sold pre-made cloth pads or at least finer fabrics for homemade ones. Information, while still taboo, might circulate a little more freely through women's magazines, albeit with heavy euphemisms, or through the sheer density of population allowing for more informal exchanges between women. However, urban life also meant crowded living conditions, less privacy, and often more rigorous work schedules in factories or domestic service, making discreet washing and drying particularly challenging. You might share a cramped room with several other people, making any private moment a rare luxury. It's a bit like trying to keep a secret in a glass house. Now, transport yourself to a remote village in the English countryside. Here, commercial menstrual products were practically non-existent. You relied entirely on what you or your community could produce: homemade pads from repurposed rags, perhaps even natural materials like moss or soft leaves if truly desperate. Access to medical professionals was severely limited. A doctor might be a day's journey away and highly expensive. Instead, you would rely on folk remedies, the advice of older female relatives, or the local wise woman. While you might have more space for discreet drying outside, perhaps in a secluded part of a garden, your life was often physically more demanding, involving farm labor or arduous domestic chores, making menstrual discomfort even harder to bear. Without respite, historians still argue whether the close-knit communities in rural areas fostered a stronger, albeit still discreet, network of female support and shared knowledge regarding menstruation. or if isolation simply amplified the burden. It's a question of whether community lessened the load, or if it was just a different kind of burden. A quirky tidbit that illustrates rural ingenuity in some agricultural areas. Women might use thoroughly cleaned and softened sheep's wool directly from their own flocks, providing a readily available and absorbent material for pads or even early tampon-like devices. You were literally living off the land for all your needs. The contrast between urban and rural life meant that a Victorian woman's period experience was far from uniform. It was a mosaic of adaptations, challenges, and quiet triumphs, shaped by her immediate environment and the resources it offered or withheld. The common thread, however, was a profound lack of widespread, accurate information and scientific understanding about menstruation itself. This absence of formal knowledge meant that women, regardless of location or class, were largely left to their own devices, a topic we will delve into next. You've navigated the varying realities of Victorian life, from city bustle to rural quiet. But regardless of location or class, one constant remained: the profound silence of science surrounding menstruation. Mainstream historical fact: throughout the Victorian era, scientific research and understanding of the female reproductive system, particularly the cyclical nature of menstruation, remained astonishingly limited and often intertwined with moral and social biases. Imagine living in an age of incredible scientific advancement in some fields: steam engines, telegraphs, Darwinian evolution, yet, when it came to half of the human population's fundamental biology, the prevailing knowledge was often rudimentary, speculative, and steeped in ancient myths. The intricate hormonal ballet that governs the menstrual cycle was completely unknown. There was no concept of estrogen or progesterone, no understanding of ovulation as a regular event that coincided with a specific phase of the cycle. Instead, theories often focused on vague notions of plethora, excess blood, monthly cleansing, or the idea that the uterus was simply shedding unnecessary material. You were expected to experience this complex biological process without any real scientific explanation for why or how it happened. It's like watching a magic trick and being told not to ask how it works. This scientific void meant that medical texts often offered little practical advice beyond rest and avoiding nervous excitement. When doctors did attempt to explain menstruation, their theories often reflected societal prejudices, portraying women as inherently weaker, more susceptible to illness, and largely defined by their reproductive capacity. The female body was seen as a fragile vessel, its natural processes often prone to derangement. Historians still argue whether this lack of scientific inquiry was a deliberate suppression driven by patriarchal discomfort with female biology, or simply a reflection of the primitive state of biological sciences at the time, combined with the difficulty of studying internal, cyclical processes without modern tools. Perhaps it was a convenient overlap of both, wasn't it? Autopsies and anatomical studies, while performed, often lacked the meticulous focus on the nuances of the female reproductive system that would be required for a deeper understanding. The modesty surrounding female bodies extended into the scientific realm, limiting direct examination and systematic research. A quirky tidbit that reveals this limitation: some medical diagrams of the era would still depict fanciful, almost mythical versions of female internal organs, rather than accurate anatomical representations, underscoring the gap between observation and true scientific inquiry. You were living in a world where even the most learned minds were often guessing. The profound lack of scientific understanding meant that women had very little factual basis for comprehending their own bodies. They were left to rely on inherited folk wisdom, personal experience, and the often misleading pronouncements of doctors. This scientific silence not only perpetuated myths and stigmas, but also severely hampered the development of effective, comfortable menstrual hygiene products. If you don't truly understand the process, how can you effectively innovate solutions for it? This brings us to the very nascent steps taken towards creating such products, even in this era of ignorance, which we will explore next. You've seen the vast chasm of scientific ignorance surrounding menstruation in the Victorian era. Yet, even within this limited understanding, human ingenuity, driven by necessity and the quiet demands of convenience, began to stir. Mainstream. Historical fact: despite the overwhelming reliance on homemade cloth, the late Victorian period saw the very emerging products of commercially manufactured menstrual hygiene items, laying the faint groundwork for the industry to come. Imagine, if you can, the sheer boldness it must have taken to even conceive of selling such a personal, taboo item. These weren't products displayed prominently in shop windows. Instead, they appeared discreetly in pharmacy catalogs or were sold under names in specialized surgical supply or hygiene stores. The earliest commercial products were essentially pre-made versions of what women were already crafting at home. Absorbent pads made of cotton, flannel, or cellulose, often designed to be worn with a belt. They might be marketed as sanitary towels, napkins, or dress shields, careful to avoid any direct mention of their true purpose. You were buying discretion and perhaps a slight upgrade in material quality. These early products were, by modern standards, incredibly crude. They often lacked adhesive strips, still requiring attachment to a belt, and their absorbency was limited. But they represented a significant step, the commercialization of a deeply private need. For women who could afford them, these ready-made pads offered a precious commodity, time saved from washing and cutting rags, and the assurance of a more consistent, perhaps more sterile, product. It's a bit like comparing a hand-spun, homespun shirt to one bought from a haberdasher. Both serve the same purpose, but one offers a greater degree of refinement and convenience. Historians still argue whether the initial push for these commercial products came from manufacturers seeing a market opportunity, or from women's silent demand for easier, more hygienic solutions. Was it supply or demand that truly ignited this nascent industry? A quirky tidbit that highlights the novelty. Some of these early products were even marketed to be disposable, though the concept of disposability was so alien to the era's frugality that many women likely still washed and reused them, regardless of manufacturer intent. Imagine throwing away something you paid good money for, when it could still serve a purpose. It shows just how ingrained the practice of reuse was. The emergence of these products, however slow and tentative, marked a pivotal shift. It moved menstruation, however slightly, from the realm of purely domestic, hidden improvisation into the burgeoning world of commerce and mass production. You were beginning to see the first whispers of an industry that would eventually revolutionize women's health and convenience. But for these products to truly take hold, they needed to overcome the pervasive societal silence and stigma, which leads us to the challenging world of early advertisements and the taboos they had to navigate. You've witnessed the hesitant birth of commercial menstrual products. But how do you sell something so utterly taboo to a public that barely acknowledges its existence? This was the challenge faced by early manufacturers, leading to a fascinating, often comical, Study in euphemism, advertisements, and taboo. Mainstream historical fact. Early Victorian and Edwardian advertisements for menstrual hygiene products employed highly discreet language, flowery euphemisms, and often vague imagery to bypass strict societal taboos surrounding the female body and its functions. Imagine flipping through a lady's home journal or a pharmacy catalogue in the late 19th century. You wouldn't see bold headlines proclaiming tampons for your period or images of confident women. Instead, you'd encounter phrases like for delicate hygiene, ladies' requisites, sanitary conveniences, or dress protectors. The product itself might be shown in a drawing, but often abstracted or partially obscured, never explicitly revealing its function. The text would focus on promises of comfort, cleanliness, and, above all, discretion. You were being sold not just a product, but the promise of maintaining your social standing and avoiding embarrassment. It's like trying to sell a secret handshake. You can't reveal too much, but you have to hint at its value. The advertisements often appealed to a woman's sense of duty and refinement. They might imply that a truly modern or hygienic woman would use such a product, subtly shaming those who continued with cruder, homemade methods. There was an unspoken insinuation that these products would allow you to move through society without the burden of your natural bodily functions becoming apparent. The message was clear. These items help you hide what must be hidden. Historians still argue whether these euphemistic advertisements, by never directly naming menstruation, ultimately reinforced the taboo, or if they were a necessary evil that allowed the products to enter the market at all, paving the way for more openness later. It's a classic chicken and egg dilemma for social progress, isn't it? A quirky tidbit from early advertising. Some product names were incredibly obscure, like Lister's towels, named after Joseph Lister, pioneer of antiseptic surgery, to imply cleanliness, or simply antiseptic napkins, focusing on the hygiene aspect rather than the function. The very names were designed to be whispered, not shouted. You were buying something almost clandestine, something that acknowledged a need without ever speaking its name aloud. These advertisements, while seemingly quaint to our modern eyes, played a crucial role in gradually normalizing the idea of purchasing, rather than solely creating, menstrual products. They gently pushed the boundaries of public discourse, albeit with extreme caution. They began to chip away at the monolithic silence surrounding menstruation, one veiled phrase at a time. The fact that these ads even existed, however couched in euphemism, spoke to a quiet, burgeoning recognition that women had specific, intimate needs that warranted commercial solutions. But for a true understanding of how women genuinely experienced this shift, we need to look beyond the advertisements and try to find their own whispered voices, which leads us to our next exploration. You've seen the discreet, almost secretive, way early menstrual products were advertised. But advertisements, by their nature, present a curated, idealized version of reality. To truly understand the lived experience of Victorian women, you need to seek out their own women's voices, whispered. Mainstream historical fact. Direct, explicit accounts of menstruation from Victorian women are exceedingly rare, largely due to the pervasive social taboo. Meaning historians often rely on indirect sources like personal letters, diaries, and fictional works to piece together their experiences. Imagine trying to find a candid discussion about periods in a Victorian woman's diary. It's like searching for a needle in a haystack, and that needle is probably labeled being unwell or my monthly indisposition. The profound shame and secrecy surrounding menstruation meant that women were highly unlikely to commit explicit details to paper, even in their most private reflections. To do so would be to acknowledge something considered unladylike, perhaps even impure. You were taught to conceal, not to confide, especially in writing that might one day be discovered. It's a bit like trying to solve a mystery where all the witnesses only speak in riddles. When mentions do appear, they are almost always brief, euphemistic, and focus on the practical inconveniences rather than the physical or emotional experience. A diary entry might simply note, "Confined to my room today," or "feeling rather low," hinting at a period without ever saying the word. Letters between close female relatives might discuss my condition or the usual, understood codes between women who shared this common, unspoken reality. These fragments are precious, offering tiny windows into a world of shared understanding and private coping mechanisms. Historians still argue whether the scarcity of direct accounts indicates that women genuinely didn't dwell on their periods as a significant hardship, or if the social pressure to not dwell on them was simply immense to ever commit such thoughts to paper. Did they truly not mind, or were they just too constrained to say so? A quirky tidbit from these rare glimpses: some women's medical guides, written by women for other women, though still operating within the societal constraints, might offer slightly more direct advice on practical hygiene or pain relief, acknowledging the existence of the monthly cycle without dwelling on it. These were often distributed quietly, hand to hand, among trusted circles. You were part of a silent sisterhood, sharing unspoken knowledge. These whispered voices, though fragmented and veiled, are vital. They show you that beneath the stiff corsets and proper manners, Victorian women were indeed navigating a complex, often uncomfortable, and deeply personal reality every month. They highlight the resilience and resourcefulness required to manage a fundamental biological process in an era determined to pretend it didn't exist. This almost complete absence of explicit discussion in personal writings extends even more broadly into the public sphere of art and literature, a fascinating void that we will explore next. You've heard the faint whispers of Victorian women's personal accounts, proving that even within profound silence, private realities existed. This deep-seated societal taboo extended even further, resulting in a striking void in public cultural expressions, the art and literature's absence. Mainstream historical fact: menstruation was almost entirely absent from mainstream Victorian art, literature, and public discourse, reflecting its status as an unmentionable and indelicate topic. Imagine browse the novels of Charles Dickens or Jane Austen, or visiting a painting exhibition of the Pre-Raphaelites. You'd find detailed descriptions of social customs, intricate plots of romance and betrayal, vivid depictions of poverty and grandeur, but you would be hard-pressed to find a single, direct reference to menstruation. This wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate omission. To include such a topic would have been considered vulgar, shocking, and utterly inappropriate for polite society, and certainly for published works or public art. You could portray death, illness, childbirth, often in dramatic, romanticized terms, but never the mundane, cyclical reality of a woman's period. It's like staging a play where half the cast mysteriously disappears for a week every month, and no one ever comments on it. This cultural silence was pervasive. Poets didn't pen odes to the monthly flow. Artists didn't depict women managing their cycles, and playwrights certainly didn't include it in their dramas. The female body, when depicted, was either idealized and chaste, or tragic and suffering. but never simply functioning in its natural, unglamorous rhythms. The biological realities were swept under the aesthetic rug, replaced by a veneer of delicate womanhood that was seemingly untouched by such unpleasantries. Historians still argue whether this literary and artistic omission was solely due to the prudish sensibilities of the era, or if it also served to maintain an idealized image of women that conveniently fit into patriarchal societal structures. Was it censorship, or merely politeness taken to an extreme? Even in medical texts, as you've seen, the language was often euphemistic and clinical, rarely venturing into the lived experience. This lack of representation in mainstream culture meant that women themselves had no public mirror for their experiences. There were no shared narratives, no artistic expressions that could validate or normalize their monthly reality. You were navigating this aspect of your life in an informational and cultural vacuum. A quirky tidbit, sometimes. Male authors would hint at a woman's delicate health or nervous condition as a plot device to explain her mood swings or temporary withdrawal from social life, unknowingly or knowingly alluding to menstruation without ever naming it. It was the great unspoken truth, lurking just beneath the surface of polite narratives. The profound absence of menstruation from Victorian art and literature speaks volumes about the depth of the taboo and the intense societal pressure to keep this aspect of female existence hidden. It contributed to the isolation women felt and reinforced the idea that this was a shameful secret to be managed privately and silently. This legacy of discretion, cultivated so deeply in the Victorian era, would cast a long shadow over future generations, shaping how women's bodies and their natural processes were perceived for decades to come. A lasting impact we'll explore next. You've explored the deep silence surrounding menstruation in Victorian art and literature, a powerful testament to the era's pervasive taboos. This profound cultural suppression didn't simply disappear with the turn of the century. It left a lasting mark, forming a legacy of discretion that profoundly shaped attitudes towards menstruation for generations. Mainstream historical fact: the Victorian era's emphasis on privacy and shame regarding menstruation continued to influence societal norms well into the 20th century, delaying open discussion and the widespread adoption of modern hygiene products. Imagine the grandmothers and great-grandmothers of the early 20th century, women who were raised firmly within the Victorian ethos. They carried the lessons of their youth. Periods were private, messy, and not to be spoken of. This ingrained discretion was passed down to their daughters and granddaughters, even as new, more convenient products like disposable pads and later tampons began to appear on the market in the early to mid-20th century. The ingrained habit of secrecy persisted. You might purchase these new products, but you still hid them away, discussed them in hushed tones, and certainly never left them out in plain sight. It's like carrying a secret handshake across generations, even when the secret is no longer necessary. This legacy meant that for decades, girls often started their periods with little to no clear information, relying on vague instructions from their mothers, much like their Victorian forebears. Sex education, let alone menstrual health education, was virtually non-existent in schools. The shame associated with menstruation contributed to a general discomfort with female bodily functions, leading to feelings of embarrassment and inadequacy for many young women. Historians still argue whether this prolonged period of secrecy led to long-term psychological impacts on women's body image and self-perception, or if it was simply a cultural norm that slowly faded with societal progress. Was it damaging or merely different? The advertising for new products, even in the mid-20th century, continued to walk a careful line, using euphemisms and focusing on freedom and confidence rather than directly addressing menstruation itself. It took decades for terms like period or menstruation to become commonplace in media, reflecting just how deeply embedded the Victorian-era silence had become. A quirky tidbit that illustrates this enduring legacy: well into the 1950s and 60s, it was still common for sanitary pads to be sold in plain brown paper bags at pharmacies, rather than their branded packaging to further ensure discretion. We're buying something so private, it needed a disguise. This enduring legacy of discretion meant that the journey towards open dialogue and comprehensive menstrual health education was a slow and arduous one. The Victorian era set a precedent for silence that would take nearly a century to truly begin to unravel. It reminds you just how powerful cultural norms can be, shaping not only what we do, but what we dare to speak of. This deep historical root, however, makes the stark contrast with our modern world all the more striking, a comparison we'll turn to next. You've traced the long shadow of Victorian discretion that stretched well into the 20th century. Now, step forward, out of the hushed parlors and into your own bathroom, and consider the modern contrast. Mainstream historical fact: the menstrual hygiene solutions available to women today represent a revolutionary departure from Victorian practices, offering unparalleled convenience, comfort, and a growing openness in public discourse. Imagine your contemporary experience. When your period arrives, you have a plethora of choices at your fingertips: disposable adhesive pads of varying absorbencies, internal tampons with applicators, menstrual cups made of medical-grade silicone, reusable cloth pads that are far more comfortable and effective than their Victorian counterparts, and even period underwear. You can walk into any supermarket or pharmacy, and these products are prominently displayed, often in brightly colored packaging, without a hint of shame. You simply choose what suits your body, your lifestyle, and your preferences. It's like having a personal hygiene buffet after centuries of a single, rather unappetizing option. The convenience is staggering. Disposable products mean no washing, no discreet drying. Menstrual cups offer hours of leak-free protection and are environmentally friendly. Tampons allow for swimming and other activities that would have been impossible or highly risky for Victorian women. The modern materials are designed for maximum absorbency, breathability, and comfort, minimizing chafing and odor. You hardly have to think about it, compared to the constant vigilance required in the 19th century. Historians still argue whether the invention of adhesive pads and tampons was the primary driver of greater openness about menstruation, or if shifting social attitudes created the demand for such innovations. Did the product enable the conversation, or did the conversation demand the product? Beyond the products themselves, the shift in public discourse is profound. While taboos certainly still exist in some corners, menstruation is now openly discussed in schools, in media, and among friends. Educational resources are readily available online and in print, providing accurate information about reproductive health. Advertisements for menstrual products are often bold and empowering, celebrating female bodies rather than subtly shaming them into hiding. A quirky tidbit that exemplifies this openness: there are now entire social media communities dedicated to discussing menstrual health, sharing tips, and advocating for destigmatization, a concept utterly unimaginable to a Victorian woman. You are part of a conversation that would have sent your ancestors into a fainting spell. This stark contrast highlights not just technological advancement, but a fundamental shift in societal attitudes towards female bodies. You were no longer expected to hide this natural process. You were empowered to manage it with ease and dignity. The journey from rudimentary cloth rags to sleek, modern solutions is a testament to progress, not just in hygiene, but in human rights and gender equality. This profound evolution in social norms, however, didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, sometimes grudging, process of shifting social norms, which is our next focus. You've just marveled at the modern conveniences and openness surrounding menstruation, a stark contrast to the Victorian era. But this transformation wasn't a sudden leap. It was the result of a slow, often arduous process of shifting social norms, mainstream historical fact. The societal silence and stigma surrounding menstruation began to gradually erode in the 20th century, influenced by advancements in public health, women's rights movements, and the commercial availability of more convenient products. Imagine the glacial pace of change. For decades after the Victorian era, the legacy of discretion persisted. Young girls still learned about their periods in hushed tones, if at all. It took concerted efforts by public health advocates, often women, to introduce basic menstrual hygiene education into schools, challenging the long-held belief that such topics were too indelicate for the classroom. These early pioneers were met with resistance, but they chipped away at the wall of silence, one pamphlet, one whispered conversation at a time. You can almost hear the slow creak of deeply ingrained social structures beginning to shift. The women's suffrage movement and later waves of feminism played an indirect but crucial role. As women fought for political and economic rights, they also implicitly, and sometimes explicitly, challenged the idea that their bodies were sources of shame or weakness. The fight for bodily autonomy extended beyond reproductive rights to include the right to openly discuss and manage all aspects of female health. Historians still argue whether the advent of commercial products created the space for social change, or if a growing desire for women's liberation fueled the demand for better products and more open dialogue. Was it the chicken or the egg that propelled this progress? The mid-20th century saw more aggressive, though still cautious, advertising campaigns that subtly pushed boundaries. Phrases like feminine protection became more common, hinting at the product's purpose without explicitly naming menstruation. The sheer availability and ease of use of disposable pads and tampons gradually made the Victorian-era struggles seem archaic, paving the way for greater acceptance. When a problem has a convenient solution, it becomes less daunting and perhaps less shameful to acknowledge. A quirky tidbit that showcases this gradual change: the term "on the rag," a direct callback to the old cloth rags, remained a common, if slightly crude, euphemism for periods well into the late 20th century, showing how language lagged behind the changing reality of products. You were living in an era where the old ways still lingered in common parlance. This slow, persistent chipping away at the Victorian legacy of silence brought us to where we are today. It was a testament to countless individual acts of quiet defiance, scientific inquiry, and social activism. The path from hidden tea bandages to menstrual cups and period underwear was not a straight line, but a winding road paved by gradual shifts in perception and courage. This profound journey, from the shadows of Victorian repression to the increasing openness of today, reveals a continuous thread, linking past practices to present understanding, which we'll explore in our final reflections. You've traveled through time, from the hushed complexities of Victorian menstrual management to the candid convenience of today. Now, as our journey nears its gentle close, let's consider how all these historical threads weave into a continuous thread connecting past practices to our present understanding of women's health and societal norms. Mainstream historical fact: the ingenuity and struggles of Victorian women in managing menstruation form an essential, though often overlooked, chapter in the broader history of women's health, autonomy, and societal progress. Imagine, for a moment, that quiet Victorian woman meticulously washing her tea bandages by hand, fearing a telltale stain or enduring pain with only ginger tea and a hot water bottle for solace. Her experience, though vastly different from your own, isn't entirely disconnected. The very need for discretion that drove her innovations. The cloth pads, the hidden drying, the layers of clothing, laid a subconscious groundwork. It highlighted a universal need that eventually spurred scientific inquiry and product development. However slowly, you see, even in silence, a demand was being created, a problem waiting for a solution. Historians still argue whether the extreme modesty of the Victorian era ultimately hindered women's progress in health and personal comfort, or if it inadvertently forced a resilience and ingenuity that later propelled advancements. It's a paradox of progress, isn't it? The shift from homemade solutions to commercial products, from euphemism to open dialogue, didn't erase the past. It built upon it. The modern menstrual cup, for instance, echoes the early, albeit crude, tampon-like devices of rolled cotton or sea sponges, perfected with modern materials and understanding. The growing movement for sustainable menstruation, embracing reusable cloth pads or period underwear, subtly revisits the Victorian practice of reusability, but now with choice and convenience, not just necessity, driving the decision. A quirky tidbit that beautifully illustrates this continuous thread. The very term napkin for a sanitary pad lingered for decades. A linguistic ghost of the original cloth rags it replaced, an echo from the past in our modern vocabulary. You are, in a small way, speaking the language of your Victorian predecessors. This historical journey teaches you that social change, especially concerning deeply ingrained taboos, is rarely instantaneous. It's a slow, often unseen evolution, propelled by countless individual adaptations, quiet innovations, and eventually the collective courage to speak what was once unspeakable. The lives of Victorian women, with their daily struggles and ingenious solutions for menstruation, were not merely a historical footnote. They were the fertile ground from which modern comfort and openness eventually bloomed. Their discreet battles for personal dignity paved the way for your contemporary freedom and understanding. As the echoes of gaslight and rustling skirts fade, you're left with a sense of profound appreciation for how far we've come. The next time you reach for a menstrual product, perhaps you'll remember the resourceful Victorian woman, silently managing her period with ingenuity and resilience, her story woven into the very fabric of progress, sweet dreams.